He was dragged out of the bank in front of everyone, shoulder dislocated, suit torn, a security guard's elbow pressing into his neck as onlookers whispered, judged, or turned away. But none of them knew the man they humiliated was about to shake their entire world. His only crime? Having the wrong skin color in the wrong lobby on the wrong morning. No raised voice. No threat. Just presence. That was enough. They saw a black man and decided what he was worth. They decided how far to push him, how much to strip from him, how deeply to bury his dignity beneath marble floors and glass smiles. But something was different about this one. Something no one in that building suspected. And when the tables turned, the fall would be louder than anything they could imagine. Before we dive into this true story of injustice, power, and the moment everything snapped, tell us where you're watching from and how you feel about what happened. Would you have stepped in? Would you have stayed silent? Comment your thoughts below. Subscribe to stay with the full story. And don't forget to like if you believe justice should never be silent. The interior of Langley First Bank gleamed with cold, expensive polish. Marble floors stretched in every direction, reflecting the light from hanging glass fixtures that looked like frozen icicles caught mid-fall. A muted hush blanketed the space, the kind bred from Wacth, hush tones, and transactions measured in 6 digits. Malachi stepped in wearing a charcoal sport coat faded at the elbows, khakis with soft creases, and shoes that had been repaired twice. He didn't look like the others gliding past reception with titanium cards and designer heels. And that was the problem. The second his foot crossed the threshold, a security guard named Royce, broad-shouldered and underemployed, intercepted him with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. His words were casual but sharp. Asked if Malachi had taken a wrong turn. Told him, not asked, that the food pantry was across the street and this wasn't the DMV. Malachi didn't react. He handed over his ID. Royce looked at it as though trying to find the smudge that proved it fake. He didn't hand it back, just nodded toward the far line marked General Services. The line for private clients, separated by velvet ropes and glass partitions, remained untouched. Malachi walked on in silence, sliding into the queue behind a woman with pearl earrings and a man checking stock tickers on his watch. The glances began almost immediately. Not overt, just the slow scan of suspicion disguised as curiosity. One floor manager, Cheston, leaned over the edge of his kiosk and whispered something to his assistant, who covered her mouth to hide smirk. Cheston's voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. He gestured in Malachi's direction and muttered something about a rehab patient trying to cash in a benefits check. Another teller, overhearing, chuckled and said something about screening the lobby better before it gets embarrassing. No one approached Malachi to ask if he needed help. After several long minutes, he stepped forward to the counter. The woman seated behind the glass didn't smile. Her badge read D, and her eyes scanned him like she was deciding whether to call someone. Malachi provided his account number and requested a meeting with the portfolio manager. Dee didn't move. She asked if he had an appointment, and when he said yes, she raised an eyebrow. She typed something into her terminal and stared at the screen too long, then told him to wait. No seat offered, no water, just a clipped nod toward a standing post near the ATM lobby. While he stood, another customer was offered espresso and ushered into a frosted glass room with brass handles and a view of the garden atrium. Cheston emerged from that same corridor moments later and locked eyes with Malachi. He made no effort to hide his distaste. Walked right up to him with a smug smile and a tablet against his chest. He asked Malachi what he was doing in the building, not why he was waiting, not what assistance he needed, but what he was doing there. Malachi gave his name and appointment reference. Cheston didn't check it, said there must be a mix-up, and directed him toward the unverified customer desk near the exit. As Malachi turned to comply, Cheston added, just loud enough for another banker to hear, that they'd had an incident last week with someone posing as a portfolio client. The woman laughed. At the unverified desk, the man behind it glanced at Malachi's ID, then at Malachi. He asked if he was delivering something. Malachi said no. The man frowned. asked again if he was with someone. Malachi gave the same response. The man said he'd check. 10 minutes passed. Nobody returned. Malachi stood unmoving. A mother walked by and pulled her child closer when passing him. A man in a crisp gray suit double-tapped his phone while staring directly at Malachi's shoes. Finally, a security supervisor approached and asked him, again, if he was sure he was in the right building. Malachi didn't answer right away. He stared at the exit, the one he had walked through less than 20 minutes ago. Then back at the man. He said yes. Yes, I'm in the right place. He stepped aside to make a call, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed the client services line, a number meant for portfolio tier account holders, the kind the bank bragged about in brochures. A gentle voice answered, pleasant and rehearsed, asking how she could assist. Malachi gave his full name, account ID, and explained that he had an appointment with the financial director, confirmed by email. There was a pause, brief but telling. She said he wasn't in the system. She asked if perhaps he had called the wrong department. He assured her he hadn't. She offered to transfer him to verification. The line clicked. A second voice came on, this one firmer, older, less trained in civility. It asked for the same information again, doubting each piece, as if Malachi were inventing it mid-sentence. This representative said the name couldn't be matched to a confirmed meeting, and if he didn't have a printed email, there was little they could do. He said he had the email on his phone. She said, that's unfortunate, and transferred him back to the main desk. He waited again. A new voice greeted him, brighter, younger, but equally dismissive in its undertone. Malachi repeated everything again, this time slower, more deliberate. The woman placed him on hold. The music played, strings and piano and falsified calm. While he waited, he watched a woman in pearls and soft pastel walk in without a name badge, without ID, without appointment. The receptionist stood immediately. She offered a bottled water, a warm towel, and within 2 minutes, the woman was led into the executive suite behind smoke glass, escorted by a man in a silk tie and snake-smooth smile. Malachi still held the phone. He was still on hold. When the music stopped, another agent picked up. She began from the top, cheerful and hollow. Malachi's jaw tensed. He asked to speak directly with someone in the building. He said he had already been here, been moved around, been degraded. She apologized, said she understood, and transferred him again. The same music returned. Back at reception, a new guest arrived. An older gentleman, white-haired, wearing sandals with a navy linen shirt and cargo shorts. He waved off the ID request, muttered something about being a legacy client, and the staff laughed. The man walked through the VIP door without delay. A manager came out to greet him halfway. Malachi watched as their laughter echoed against marble. Still holding the phone, he stepped forward and asked the receptionist if there had been any updates on his appointment. She blinked, asked for his name again, typed something in, told him she couldn't find any record of a Darius account. He corrected her. Malachi. She said, oh, still nothing. Her voice held no apology, just distance. He asked if she could check another database. She sighed and said it wouldn't help. He asked if he could speak to someone in person. She looked over her shoulder, said they were short-staffed, said all appointment only, today. She gestured at the same wall where the woman in pearls had disappeared behind minutes earlier. His phone disconnected. The hold line had dropped. He stood frozen for a moment, then redialed. This time, he asked for corporate verification. The operator transferred him. Another pause. Another new voice. This one male, brisk, annoyed at the interruption to routine. He asked again for Malachi's details. Malachi gave them word for word. The voice paused. This time, it confirmed something. Yes, there was an entry, pending verification, marked inactive. Malachi asked what that meant. The man said it likely meant the account was under review. Malachi asked why. The man said he wasn't at liberty to say. Malachi said it was his account. The man said still, he wasn't cleared for that information, then asked if there was anything else he could assist with. Malachi didn't respond. He hung up. At the far end of the lobby, A junior banker in a blue blazer called out a name, Mr. Pritchard. A portly man in a floral shirt waved his hand. The banker jogged over with a tablet and led him to the private suite with unforced smiles. Malachi sat down in one of the lobby's heavy leather chairs, the kind designed to discourage lingering. The receptionist glanced at him once more, then back to her screen. A young man in khakis and a tuck shirt walked in, holding a dog-eared folder and talking loudly about fund reallocation. He was immediately greeted by name. Malachi sat still, the only unmoving object in a room full of fluid wealth. His phone buzzed. It was an automated survey asking if his service experience had been excellent. He stared at the screen, closed it without response. From across the lobby, a banker with sharp cheekbones, polished loafers, and a navy suit cut too tight across the shoulders approached. His name tag read Reagan Lyles, and his smirk arrived 5 seconds before he did. Reagan didn't offer a greeting or a handshake. He stood above Malachi, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in calculation. "You all right, buddy? Need directions to the public facilities? They're around back. You don't have to come inside the bank to get change for the bus." The words were smooth, practiced, offered just loud enough to turn heads, just quiet enough to deny later. Malachi looked up, expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't flinch. Reagan tilted his head. "I mean, come on. You've been sitting here for over an hour. That's either commitment or confusion. If you're here for the heating shelter forms, that's the next building over." A laugh barked out behind them. A heavy-set man with cufflinks and a gleaming Rolex had just stepped off the elevator and caught the tail end of Reagan's performance. The man slapped Reagan's shoulder with a familiarity that wasn't welcome and said loud enough for everyone in the marble hall to hear, "I think I saw him digging through the trash bins on 3rd Street last week. Same coat." Reagan didn't deny it. He chuckled, then turned back to Malachi with a wink and asked if he wanted him to go fetch some soup. "Because, man, you look like you haven't eaten since last tax season." Every syllable that followed wasn't just insulting, it was intentional. Malachi didn't need to imagine the onlookers staring. He could feel the heat of their eyes pressed into his spine. The receptionist behind the desk didn't even raise her head. She typed with mechanical detachment as if nothing was happening. Cheston passed by on the way to the espresso bar, glanced at the scene, and kept walking. No one intervened. No one objected. This was theater, and they were the audience, and he was the joke. Reagan lowered his voice then, leaned in close, and said something that didn't echo, but it landed harder. "You know what people like you don't understand? This place was built to keep certain people in and others out. You don't dress the part. You don't look the part. Hell, you don't even smell like the part." Malachi inhaled, slow and measured, eyes locked on the fake marble floor tile under his shoe. He said nothing. His silence was not weakness. It was containment, the kind born from years of rooms like this and men like Reagan. But the verbal assault didn't end. Reagan took a step back, waved a hand in front of his nose dramatically, and said to the receptionist, "For real though, can someone check if the HVAC is busted? I'm catching something funky from this corner." The laughter that followed was sharp and short. No one questioned it. No one silenced it. Minutes later, Malachi stood and walked to the front desk again. Not to escalate, not to retaliate, but to ask again, calmly, if anyone had an update regarding his meeting. Brienne, the receptionist, looked surprised he was still there. She gave him a puzzled expression, like someone confronted with a riddle, then replied with vague platitudes. She said someone was checking the schedule. She said staffing was tight. She said to please be patient. Her tone was rehearsed. Her eyes never met his. He asked if there was a printed log he could check himself. She said that wasn't possible. He asked if someone from upstairs could come down. She said that wasn't procedure. Behind him, Reagan reappeared. This time with 2 cappuccinos in hand. One for himself, the other for the man who had made the trash bin comment. The two leaned against the glass wall near the concierge desk, watching Malachi, like he was a zoo exhibit. Reagan whispered something, and the other man burst out laughing. Malachi didn't turn. He simply stood at the counter as if still in line, though there was no queue, and no purpose. Behind the glass wall, the elevator dinged softly. Another group of suited executives walked past without acknowledgement. The world moved on, and he remained a stone in the stream. At some point, Brienne picked up the phone. She whispered something, turned away so he couldn't read her lips, nodded, and hung up. She glanced at him, then looked back down. Nothing changed. No action followed. Malachi's presence had been turned into background noise. The clock said 11:26 a.m. Nearly 90 minutes since he had entered this building. Moments later, the bulky security guard from earlier, Royce, returned, approached slowly like someone pretending to offer help while concealing a leash. He asked Malachi to come with him, said there had been a request upstairs to verify a few things regarding his account status. The words were offered like olive branches, but Malachi knew better. He followed without protest, his gait measured, controlled, the weight of every insult building beneath his feet like wet cement. Royce led him past the customer lounge, away from public view, through a door marked staff only that closed behind them with a mechanical thud. The hallway beyond was narrow and dim, lined with outdated posters about compliance and staff integrity. They turned left past a supply closet, then stopped in front of a metal door with no signage. Royce opened it and gestured inside. The room was barely larger than a janitor's storage bay, no windows, a single metal chair bolted to the floor beside a plain desk. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Malachi stepped in. Royce closed the door behind him. There was no explanation. No one else entered the room for several minutes. Then the questions began. A man in a white shirt and striped tie stepped in, holding a clipboard with too few pages to be worth carrying. He didn't introduce himself. He asked for Malachi's name again, despite it being printed on the folder, then asked for the last 4 digits of his social security number, which he already had. He asked who Malachi banked with. Malachi responded evenly, "This bank." The man made a note, asked where Malachi got his client number from. Malachi replied, "For my account registration." Another note. Then came the real tone, the one Malachi knew would eventually surface. The casual disdain dressed in feigned curiosity. The man looked up from the clipboard and asked whether Malachi had ever actually opened a financial account before, or if this was some kind of assistance request. He asked if Malachi had someone who usually helped him read through statements. His eyes flicked to Malachi's hands. He asked whether Malachi had any financial literacy documents to support his claims. Then paused, tapped the folder, and chuckled. "These numbers," he said, holding up the page. "Do you even understand what they mean?" Malachi gave no answer. Another man entered. This one wore a badge on his belt. Internal security, though not law enforcement. His first words weren't questions. They were statements, accusations posed as routine. He said they'd had several fraud attempts lately involving identity misuse. He said Malachi's presence was flagged by someone upstairs. He said it was unusual for someone to linger in the lobby with a high-value appointment and no confirmation. He flipped through the folder and asked why Malachi had multiple account IDs linked to different regional offices. Malachi explained evenly that his financial firm operated in multiple states. The man didn't write that down. Instead, he turned to Royce, who had reappeared in the doorway, and asked if Malachi had shown any agitation in the lobby. Royce shrugged and said he was calm. Too calm. Then came the third questioner, a woman in a navy blouse who sat at the desk opposite him and scanned her tablet. She asked whether Malachi was working with a financial advisor or just interpreting things independently. She asked how long he had claimed to be affiliated with the bank's upper-tier client group. Malachi corrected her language. "I don't claim anything. I am affiliated." She raised an eyebrow. Then she leaned back and asked if he had someone they could contact to verify his background. "A supervisor, maybe," she said, "or someone who could vouch for your credentials." Malachi answered, "My credentials stand on their own." The woman didn't reply. She just looked at him as if he had said nothing at all. Time stretched inside the small room. No clock, no water, no phone access. Just blank walls and slow suffocation in the form of doubt. They asked again for the nature of his visit. They asked again why he had come dressed the way he did. They asked again why he didn't just wait to be contacted. When Malachi asked for a reason why he was being held in the room, the second man said, "This isn't detainment. You're just being asked to wait somewhere secure while we clarify a few things." Malachi asked if this was standard practice. The man answered with a shrug. For some clients, yes. Malachi sat still, spine straight against the cold plastic back of the chair, both palms resting quietly on his knees, his breathing slow and deliberate. The door finally opened without ceremony. Royce returned, not with a clarification, not with an apology, but with a clipped motion of his hand that signaled Malachi to stand. No words, just that silent command layered with authority and arrogance. Malachi rose without hesitation, gathered his briefcase from a floor beside him, and stepped toward the exit. As he passed through the hallway again, escorted like a suspect, he asked calmly if he could speak with the assigned financial officer who had confirmed the appointment. Royce didn't answer. He just opened the next door. They emerged not in the same lobby, but in a side corridor adjacent to a lower traffic vestibule near the western exit. Another banker stood waiting, tall, sharp-faced, a silver badge pinned to his lapel that read Operations. He glanced at Malachi and then at Royce and immediately asked where the man had gotten the credentials he'd been carrying. Malachi, in an even tone, repeated the same information he'd given 5 times that morning. The man raised his hand and cut him off mid-sentence. Then, in full view of 2 other staffers and a client in line, he reached out and snatched the briefcase from Malachi's grasp. There was no warrant, no authority, no pretense of procedure, just the belief that he could. The clasp came loose, and the contents spilled across the marble floor. Neatly stacked papers, transaction logs, certified letters, a signed agreement from the firm's upper management bearing Malachi's full name and designation. But none of that mattered. One staffer nearby gasped, not out of concern but disbelief. Disbelief that Malachi had dared to carry a briefcase with documents. The operations manager knelt down, rifled through a few pages as if searching for the lie, then held one up like evidence. He stared at it with narrowed eyes before tossing it back to the ground and saying with a dry laugh, "These look like intake files from the State Corrections Board." The receptionist at the side desk laughed. One of the junior bankers added, "Man came dressed for a parole meeting. No wonder he's confused." Malachi said nothing. He began collecting the documents without haste, folding each one with precise care, stacking them again despite the filth of the floor, despite the scorn in every direction. As he stood, a voice called out across the lobby, loud, clear, and meant to be heard. It belonged to a man in a 3-piece suit standing on the upper balcony above the mezzanine, holding a folder and pointing at Malachi. He declared, "That individual has exhibited behavior consistent with prior incidents we've flagged. Our team is authorized to intervene where necessary to protect client integrity." His voice echoed. Conversations paused. A few heads turned. Phones were lowered. A ripple passed through the room like a draft, subtle but irreversible. Malachi froze for half a second, then continued reorganizing his files. The briefcase clicked shut. The man continued, voice steady and filled with bureaucratic poison. He stated that the bank reserved the right to remove individuals whose conduct or presence could compromise the experience of verified clients. He used phrases like operational discretion, institutional authority, and behavioral inconsistency, each one carefully crafted to mask prejudice with policy. No one challenged him. No one questioned the authority behind the words. Royce stood beside Malachi the entire time, saying nothing, arms crossed, presence looming like shadow. When Malachi finally turned to leave, the operations manager blocked his path and asked him again where he had obtained the financial officer's contact. Malachi didn't answer. The man stepped closer, lowered his voice, and said, "Let's be honest, you were never supposed to be in here. You knew it. We knew it. So now you go." Malachi walked toward the exit. He moved slowly, deliberately, shoulders square, posture unwavering. As he passed the reception desk, a woman whispered to her colleague, "Maybe now we can get back to real clients." The words weren't meant to be private. Another added, "Whole vibe's been off since he came in." Someone near the door muttered something about security being too lenient these days. No one held the door. No one looked him in the eye. No one said his name. He chewed his gum with slow, deliberate rhythm as he watched a security feed flicker to life on his wall-mounted monitor, showing a wide-angle view of the lobby where Malachi had just been escorted from the premises. Without looking away from the screen, Cordell muttered that this is what happens when people mistake access for belonging. He tilted his head toward his assistant, who stood awkwardly by the door, and said in a voice dripping with arrogance that certain types should understand by now this system wasn't built with them in mind. The assistant gave a weak laugh, unsure if it was a joke, but not at all the same. Cordell rolled his eyes. He said the guy looked like he walked in off a maintenance truck, not a financial trust board. He asked if anyone actually believed a man dressed like that had 7 digits in any account that didn't belong to someone else. When the assistant didn't answer, Cordell leaned back and muttered that maybe it was time to consider setting new visual standards for client access. Maybe, he said, we should start screening for aesthetic fit the way luxury hotels screen for credit holds. The assistant said nothing. Cordell pulled his phone from the desk, tapped a few keys, and scrolled until he found a message thread titled External Optics, Tier Screening. He opened a draft and began dictating. Proposal for signage revisions. Consider including discreet reminders for proper business attire in high-value spaces. Preventative messaging could reduce foot traffic from lower-tier demographics. Then he added a laughing emoji and typed, "We're not running a soup kitchen." He hit send. Downstairs, 2 junior bankers near the coffee bar stood gossiping. One, a man named Ashton with slick hair and narrow suits, remarked that the guy they just booted should be grateful he even got through the doors. The other, a younger woman with a lanyard full of access badges, said someone should put a sign on the front entrance. "If your outfit costs less than $50, try another bank." Ashton snorted. He mimed writing it on a plaque. "Langley first, where excellence is expected and thrift stores disqualify." Neither of them saw anything wrong. No one around them did either. It was just language, just levity, just the culture as it had always been. Back upstairs, Cordell received an update from Cheston via internal message. It read simply, "He's gone. No issues." Cordell replied with a thumbs up, then leaned forward and turned the monitor off. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out across the skyline. "They always come in thinking they've proven something," he said to no one. "They forget that we write the rules here." Behind him, a wall of awards gleamed under recessed lighting. Compliance Excellence, Equity Initiative of the Year, Top Performing Branch in Urban Markets. Cordell smirked. He chewed harder. Then he muttered under his breath, "Just because you can buy a ticket doesn't mean you're invited backstage." In the lobby, the receptionist Brienne had resumed her idle scrolling. A couple walked in dressed in weekend luxury, soft leather, effortless air. She stood quickly, offered them her full attention, her best smile. She handed them sparkling water, called for a manager. Neither had an appointment. Neither needed one. They looked right. They moved right. They belonged. Meanwhile, another banker walked past the chair Malachi had sat in for nearly 2 hours. The crumpled dollar bill still lay in the corner. The banker picked it up between 2 fingers and dropped it in the waste bin like a used napkin. Outside, a gust of dry wind stirred dust along the sidewalk as Malachi moved farther from the building, the briefcase still in his grip, the documents inside still perfectly folded, still valid, still proof. But proof meant nothing when the system rejected the premise of your worth before reading the facts. Inside, Cordell had already forgotten the name, already moved on to reviewing end-of-quarter profit margin forecasts, already joking in a private thread about adding facial recognition to the lobby cameras. Not for security, he wrote, just to save time identifying who doesn't qualify. A laughing reply came back. Make it AI. Program it to detect off-brand shoes. The moment the first vibration shook the surface of Cordell Briggs' desk, he didn't notice. The call display on the desk phone blinked 3 times before the sound registered. Cordell was too busy thumbing through his personal messages, still half amused by the joke about AI shoe filters that Ashton had posted an hour earlier. He reached for the receiver lazily, chewing the final bit of gum into tasteless pulp, and tapped the speaker button with 2 fingers. The line opened with a sharp, clipped voice that sliced through the polished calm of his office like a cold knife. "Is this the branch director of Langley First, Midtown?" Cordell frowned slightly and leaned forward, his chair creaking. "Speaking." The voice didn't introduce itself, didn't waste a second. "This is Brixton Financial's audit liaison. We're calling to confirm that our complete withdrawal order has been executed. The figure should reflect $2.6 billion as of 9:03 a.m. Eastern. Please confirm receipt." Cordell's lips parted, but no words formed. He stared at the phone, confused at first, then laughed quietly to himself as if it had to be a mistake, some miscommunication. He cleared his throat and said, "I'm sorry, what order?" The voice continued without pause. "Our CEO authorized full divestment from Langley First as of this morning. The holdings included 6 corporate accounts, 9 managed portfolios, and 3 institutional insurance assets. This information was communicated to your executive office via encrypted message at 8:46 a.m. I assume the system logged the termination protocol. If not, I can resend confirmation." Cordell sat motionless. The blood drained slowly from his face as the reality settled like dust across his skin. He glanced at his monitor, hands suddenly clammy, opened the terminal, and within seconds saw the red highlighted freeze notices stacking one by one under the corporate ID tags. He whispered almost involuntarily, "This has to be a mistake." But the voice wasn't finished. Also, it said, "Your regional compliance officer will be in touch shortly to coordinate the auditing of all interactions associated with client ID M. Rivers. As per standard protocol, if misconduct is confirmed, Langley First may be held liable under Clause 12B. Cordell's hand jerked toward the volume dial, lowering it instinctively, then hesitated. His stomach turned. The initials. M. Rivers. His eyes darted to the timestamp, 9:03 a.m. The very moment Malachi had walked silently out of the front door. A silence now broken. A history now revealed. He stood abruptly, knocking over a tumbler of water that soaked the edge of a client profile binder. As the call ended, Cordell leaned forward again and whispered to himself, "Who the hell is he?" Downstairs, Malachi sat on a granite bench just outside the west-facing entrance of the bank. The sunlight stretched long shadows beneath the morning traffic, but he remained unmoving, his posture relaxed, his hands folded over his briefcase. The same case, the same documents, the same man who had been shamed, mocked, detained, and dismissed, now sitting in perfect stillness as the building behind him began to feel its foundation shift. A senior staffer rushed out the doors a few minutes later, phone pressed to ear, face pale, trying to reach someone who no longer took his calls. Moments later, Brienne received a memo. It was short, typed in all caps. "Halt all internal communications regarding client M. Rivers. Do not engage. CEO review pending." Inside, whispers began circulating faster than emails. Ashton was the first to check the internal directory. One search, one result. Malachi Rivers, founder, Brixton Financial. Board chair, Vanguard Strategic Holdings. He refreshed the page. Checked again. Same name. Same man. He stood slowly, mouth dry, and walked toward Cheston's desk without a word. Cheston saw his face and asked what was wrong. Ashton handed him his tablet. Cheston read the screen, then looked up like he'd seen a ghost. "No," he said. "That can't be." Ashton said nothing. Upstairs, Cordell dialed the regional CEO. Straight to voicemail. He left no message. He sat down, stunned, as the call from corporate legal came through. His hand shook slightly as he picked up. This time, he did not use speakerphone. At the curb, a black sedan pulled up and idled. Malachi did not rush. He stood slowly, adjusted the sleeves of his jacket, and opened the rear door himself. Before stepping in, he looked up once, not at the building, but at the second-floor window where Cordell had been standing just hours earlier, overseeing the system he thought he controlled. Then Malachi got into the car and closed the door. The vehicle pulled away in silence. No one wanted to meet each other's eyes. Not Brienne, who had just received a silent text from corporate HR asking for a statement on the morning's incident. Not Ashton, who was now pacing behind the teller line trying to remember every word he'd said about shoe prices. Not Reagan, who hadn't spoken since the second memo came in, an internal directive marked confidential that read, "All employees are to preserve all CCTV, audio recordings, and written logs referencing client ID M. Rivers. Legal is initiating incident review. Pending liability." By the elevators, Cheston stood clutching the file folder he had previously tossed aside. It was clean now, neatly res-tacked, pressed into a slim manila sheath that no longer fluttered with disarray, but carried weight in its silence. He had just finished scanning the contents, page by page, each one more damning than the last. At the top, a letter signed by the CEO of Langley First Bank National Holdings, dated 2 years earlier, authorizing Brixton Financial as an exclusive strategic partner. The agreement outlined privileged rates, unrestricted access to cross-regional branches, and executive-level override permissions. The next page bore a security clearance index, listing Malachi Rivers not just as a client, but as a key holder, one of 6 individuals with Tier 0 override. Cheston swallowed hard. The words blurred slightly as his mind played back every insult, every order he had ignored, every smirk he had failed to question. The final page of the packet carried a single line in bold ink beneath the signature. "This agreement is in effect until terminated by the signatory or at the will of Brixton Financial, with or without cause. No condition, no expiration, full authority." Upstairs, Cordell finally stood, legs unsteady, as he opened the panel behind his office's bookshelf and removed the secured fax terminal used only for legal correspondence. He inserted a clean form into the feeder and stared at the message, now blinking on the small LED screen. The text read, "Termination request, effective immediately. Subject, Brixton Financial Partnership. Revocation of all authorizations. Instruction, seal all related files. Freeze residual holdings. Mark accounts, closed and no return." His assistant appeared behind him, pale and stammering. "Is it real?" she whispered. Cordell nodded once, unable to speak. Moments later, the printer whirred, ejecting the confirmation slip. He held the page in trembling fingers. On the bottom corner was a handwritten initial. M.R. Malachi Rivers had submitted the revocation himself. The sender line bore his office's private branch code. The entire transaction had occurred remotely, clean, final, irreversible. Outside on the sidewalk across from the bank, Malachi remained in the back seat of the sedan, engine running, windows up. He watched without emotion as a young intern ran from the side door, holding an envelope marked internal escalation, the kind usually delivered under escort. The intern didn't know it, but he was carrying the death sentence of a decades-long partnership. Malachi's driver, sensing something shift in the energy of the moment, glanced in the rearview mirror. Malachi didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply lifted a small remote from his pocket, pressed a single key, and nodded once. Inside, the lobby screens flickered as the client displays refreshed. 5 corporate accounts disappeared in real time. Balances dropped to 0. A banner usually reserved for holiday notices now displayed a single rotating message. Account restricted. Please contact branch manager. Reagan, watching it happen from the teller's bay, felt the weight of each 0 vanish, like oxygen being sucked from the room. One after another, every digital signature tied to Brixton Financial fell into archive lock. Malachi hadn't spoken a single public word, but the message couldn't have been louder. Brienne turned to Cheston, voice barely audible. "He could have destroyed us in the first 10 minutes. Cheston nodded, still gripping the manila folder. "He waited 2 hours," he said. "He let us write our own execution." Ashton received the 3rd memo just before noon. This one wasn't from compliance. It was from corporate media strategy. Subject line, "Prepare coordinated statement client incident Langley First Midtown." The attached draft was blunt. Langley First Bank deeply regrets the experience of Mr. Malachi Rivers and is reviewing internal protocols immediately. All employees involved have been placed under conduct review. Formal apology to follow. Ashton turned the screen away and whispered, "We're going to lose everything." Cordell tried one last call to someone he thought could reverse it, an old contact in executive risk management. The line rang once. Then a voice answered. It was Malachi's general counsel. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer pleasantries. He simply said, "If this call is recorded, hang up. If not, prepare your legal team." Then he ended the call. Cordell Briggs' name topped the list, bolded and underlined. Attached was a calendar link with a one-on-one meeting time scheduled for 2 p.m. with the bank's National Disciplinary Board. Cordell didn't respond. He didn't have to. His ID badge had already been deactivated. When he tried to re-enter his office after stepping out to breathe, the sensor blinked red. The elevator rejected his floor. His access had vanished as swiftly and cleanly as the funds from Brixton Financial's accounts. Word spread across the branch faster than any press release could contain. HR arrived on site before 1, escorted by security. The director of regional oversight entered without greeting anyone, flanked by 2 members of the independent ethics panel. Cheston, Reagan, Brienne, Ashton, all were pulled into separate conference rooms, asked not to return to their desks. Each was handed a sealed envelope, marked confidential review notice. Ashton opened his first, skimmed the lines, and slumped into his chair. Reagan didn't even open his. He simply folded it in half and placed it on the table, expression vacant. Brienne stared at hers without blinking, tears forming in the corners of her eyes but never falling. Cheston tried to argue. He raised his voice, said it wasn't fair, said no one had told him. But the woman from ethics said only one thing. That's the point. You were never supposed to need a reminder to act human. In a private conference line from headquarters, Langley First's chief risk officer gave the press team the directive they'd been dreading. Prepare for exposure. The order was blunt. We're not getting ahead of this. The only way through it is with full acknowledgement. That same hour, Bloomberg published a breaking story. Langley First faces racial discrimination scandal after billionaire client reveals targeted harassment. Within minutes, Reuters and CNBC followed suit. The article quoted anonymous sources, confirmed disciplinary action, cited internal memos, and most damning of all, included verification from Brixton Financial's legal counsel. It wasn't rumor. It was fact. By 2:43 p.m., the stock price began to dip. At first, a trickle, then a drop, then a plunge. Investors were spooked not just by the scandal, but by the confirmation that a top-tier institutional client had cut ties without warning. Analysts began projecting class action vulnerabilities. A shareholder in Atlanta filed an emergency motion demanding a review of board leadership. A compliance blogger leaked internal chat logs from a junior staff group where jokes made about client screening, policies included racist undertones, and coded references to appearance-based profiling. In the branch lobby, the TV mounted above the concierge counter was set to a news station. For once, no one muted it. The headline scrolling across the bottom read, "Langley First scrambles after billionaire pullout sparks civil rights probe." Customers waiting in line began to shift, whispering among themselves. Some left quietly. Some stared in disbelief. Others recorded the news segment on their phones, their expressions unreadable. A woman in her 60s approached a teller and asked if her accounts were still held at this branch. The teller hesitated before responding. Then she too was escorted into the back by a manager who had just been told to suspend front-facing operations until further notice. By mid-afternoon, the bank's CEO issued an internal video memo. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm behind the camera. He stated that Langley First would undergo a full audit across all national branches, starting with Midtown. He admitted failure. He used the words systemic failure. No spin. No excuses. Cordell's termination was confirmed in a second message, subject line, "Leadership change effective immediately." His profile was erased from the company intranet. His name was pulled from corporate documents. his photo removed from executive directories. The branch staff received one final instruction that day: clear your schedules. All clients will be redirected. All meetings suspended. All personnel subject to interview. Outside, a civil rights attorney from Washington announced the launch of a formal inquiry into Langley First's operational conduct. She stood on the steps of the bank's main headquarters with cameras flashing and a growing crowd behind her. She said that no individual should be made to endure what Mr. Rivers experienced. That respect should not be conditional. That wealth should not be a prerequisite for dignity. That institutions, no matter how prestigious, must be held accountable for the culture they cultivate. Her voice carried. It reached beyond walls and boardrooms. It reached into every corner of a company built too long on assumptions and unchecked power. In the weeks that followed the implosion of Langley First's Midtown branch, the world did what it always does after spectacle. It moved on. Headlines faded from the ticker. Investors recalibrated. Press releases reshaped the narrative, and other stories began to dominate the airwaves. But inside the lives of those who had stood at the heart of the storm, change came not with noise, but with reckoning. Cordell Briggs, once a man whose name invoked fear or favor, depending on who spoke it, no longer entered rooms with presence. He left the city quietly, declined interviews, turned down offers from boutique consulting firms desperate to rebrand his expertise. Instead, he settled in a town 2 states south with no connection to finance, where he rented a 1-bedroom unit above a hardware store and applied for a license in counseling. The man who once authored policies with precision and used silence as a weapon now sat across from strangers in folding chairs, listening to stories of being ignored, dismissed, misjudged. He didn't speak much about his past, only admitted, when pressed, that there had been a time he'd mistaken power for purpose. His application essay for state certification began with one line: "I thought I understood people because I managed them. Now I listen because I never did." Reagan Lyles, who had once drawn laughter by mocking a man's coat and scent, found himself unable to return to the banking industry. The termination on his record, coupled with a viral transcript of his exact words, made him unhireable in any environment with public interaction. He withdrew from his circle of friends, disconnected his accounts, and spent weeks in isolation until one afternoon he found himself standing in front of a brick community center on the edge of the city, the kind of place he used to speed past without a glance. Inside, he learned the building housed a youth mentorship program supported by Brixton Financial. Malachi's name was on a plaque near the entrance, beneath a quote that read, "Teach dignity before ambition." Reagan stood there for nearly an hour before walking inside. When a staff member asked what brought him in, he didn't lie. He said he had failed to see people as people, that he wanted to learn how. They didn't turn him away. They didn't shake his hand either. They gave him a clipboard, a training manual, and a chance. That was enough. Cheston Wade never returned to corporate work. After his suspension became public, he moved into freelance financial writing, but quickly abandoned it after receiving more backlash than readership. His apology, issued in the form of a long-form blog post, was met with skepticism, but in time, he redirected his efforts toward building a platform for anonymous testimonies from workers who'd experienced workplace discrimination. He didn't moderate the content. He simply published and watched quietly as hundreds of stories poured in. Some were rage-filled. Some were quiet. Some sounded exactly like what he had once dismissed. He didn't justify. He just read. Every single one. Brienne and Ashton both resigned before formal proceedings could determine their fate. In separate letters, they cited mental health and burnout. But what they left unsaid was clearer. Guilt is not always loud. Sometimes it lingers like smoke, visible to those who carry it. Ashton returned to school for social work. Brienne relocated and enrolled in a night program to become a teacher. Neither forgot, neither denied. They simply decided that the people they had been were no longer welcome in the lives they wanted to lead. As for Cordell, he eventually spoke publicly. It happened not on a stage, not in front of press, but in a local radio interview arranged by one of the patients from his group sessions. The interviewer asked what he would say to the man he once called an outsider. Cordell answered slowly, with no script. I didn't just fail him. I failed myself. Because I was given a position to uphold value, and I used it to validate vanity. I know who he is now, and I hope someday he knows I finally saw it. The host asked if he thought redemption was possible. Cordell paused. Redemption doesn't begin when you're forgiven. It begins when you change, knowing you might never be. Meanwhile, Malachi Rivers continued his work quietly. He never gave a statement to the press. He never appeared in court because he never filed a lawsuit. The weight of what happened had already settled itself. Instead, he redirected new resources into the community fund, expanded the scholarship program, and opened 2 new career training centers. One of them employed Reagan, not because of pity, but because of change. Malachi did not forget. He simply chose not to carry bitterness where responsibility had taken root. In a private memo to his leadership team, he wrote, "Justice without vengeance is the only kind that heals." And so the story came full circle. A man who had walked into a bank to complete a transaction left having triggered a transformation. The systems that once thrived on exclusion found themselves exposed, their weaknesses no longer deniable. And those who had built their pride on other people's pain were forced to face the ruins of their design. But in that ruin, there was space. Space to learn, space to rebuild, space to become more than the sum of past failures. Some people left. Some were left behind. But a few stayed. A few bent. A few broke. And decided to be better for it. The end. If this story moved you, let us know by subscribing for more powerful narratives like this one. What part of Malachi's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the silence, the reveal, or the redemption? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And tell us where you're watching from today. Your voice adds to the story.